A reading from the Gospel of Matthew, the 26th chapter, verses 47 to 52. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword and drew it and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will die by the sword." Of all the people who helped shape Martin Luther King Jr.'s visionary leadership in the civil rights movement, the one advisor who perhaps made all the difference was a man named Bayard Rustin. Most know Bayard Rustin for his historic role in planning the March on Washington in 1963, but few are aware that it was Rustin who, years earlier, convinced Dr. King to fully embrace nonviolence as an indispensable tactic in the civil rights movement. In 1955, as Dr. King led his first civil rights campaign in Montgomery, Alabama, he began receiving death threats. And fearing for his life and his family's safety, he armed himself to defend his family. King had studied Gandhi's nonviolent philosophy, but had not yet fully embraced it. When Rustin, who had years of experience in nonviolent action, traveled to Montgomery with his group of advisors to visit King, he was surprised to discover that King's home was so full of guns that someone almost sat on a gun that was resting in a chair. Rustin took King aside and explained to him that if he was going to lead the protest in Montgomery, he couldn't go armed. Nonviolent action, said Rustin, means no guns. King would have to make a choice. Rustin's counsel had a profound impact on King. Suddenly, nonviolence became more than just a reference and a speech for him. He had now to commit himself to everything he'd read and studied about nonviolence. And this was the moment when King fully adopted nonviolence as a way of life. King's reluctant journey toward nonviolence reminds us of what the Buddhist spiritual writer Thich Nhat Hanh once said, that the longest journey we will ever take is the 18 inches from our head to our heart. Some people never make that journey. They will fall in love with an ideal but fail to put it into practice. And by their inaction, they fulfill that famous prophecy of the novelist Walker Percy, who said you can get all A's and still flunk life. When it comes to nonviolence, that's especially true. Nonviolence as an ideal, as a philosophy, is powerless unless it's applied as a practice, as a way of life. And yet, even as King understood, it's so impractical when so much is on the line. Nonviolence seems like a noble aspiration, but as a rule of life, it feels extremely unrealistic, even naive. I mean, just listen to what we've heard so far in this series and ask yourself where any of this might actually get you in the long run. If your enemy strikes you on one cheek, offer the other. If he sues you for your shirt, give him your coat also. Bless your enemy. Do not repay evil for evil. Do not avenge yourself. If your enemy is hungry, feed him if he's thirsty, offer him something to drink, overcome evil with good. How could any of this highly impractical, non-violent advice actually be good for anyone but our enemy? And yet we forget to ask ourselves about the alternative, which is really our default way of life. Whenever has violence actually been good or effective for us in the end? Consider where any of us these violent tactics might get you. Try this. If your enemy strikes you, strike him back. If he sues you, sue him back. Curse your enemy. Repay his evil acts with some evil acts of your own. Take revenge until he cries uncle. And if he's hungry, let him starve to death. And if he's thirsty, do not give him even a drop of water. Conquer evil with evil. Where has that ever gotten anyone? From time to time, we may resort to such actions, thinking we'll feel justified or heard or valued or redeemed, or at least maybe a little safer in the end. But the truth is, such actions only leave us feeling exhausted and bruised and ashamed and estranged, and we feel less than human for having done them. And they drain us of emotional and mental and physical and spiritual energy, because not only does nothing good come of them, but in doing them, it actually feels like something vital within us, our very soul, is dying or even has just died. I believe that's what Jesus means when he tells his disciple in today's gospel reading that those who take the sword will die by the sword. This little one-liner from Jesus has been turned into that popular proverb that says, those who live by the sword die by the sword, and that is not actually a bad translation. In the Greek, the word translated as taking the sword can also imply living by the sword. It can literally mean to take or to draw a sword as if from its sheath, but it can also mean, in broader, more metaphorical terms, to take or receive into oneself, or to give assent to an idea of what that sword represents. In other words, the sword is not just an actual weapon to be taken up in battle. The sword is a philosophy that we take up in life, a philosophy about how to deal with conflict, a myth, actually, that claims that only violence can defeat violence. The sword is a symbol for the violent cultural narrative by which we live our lives. Put your sword back into its place, says Jesus, for all who take the sword will die by the sword. And what Jesus is saying here is what we already know experientially to be true, that living our lives according to the popular myth that only violence can solve our conflicts with others and fix the problems of society, this fiction is the way of death. Living our lives according to the philosophy of the sword will always lead to death, says Jesus. And not just physical death, but maybe an even worse kind of death that happens while we're still living. A kind of spiritual death that entombs us in our biases and hatreds, ossifying our hearts and closing our minds so they can never have to be changed. A kind of relational death that sorts us into tribes so that we never have to encounter and learn from our opponents. A kind of moral death that prioritizes winning at all costs and justifies victory by any means necessary. And a kind of soul death that buries us in delight over the suffering and humiliation of our opponent. All who live by this philosophy of the sword, says Jesus, will die by the sword. Only sometimes the dying is so subtle and takes so long that we don't even know it's actually happening until it's too late. Jesus knew what we all know, that the philosophy of the sword always leads to death, because while swords can kill people, they cannot kill ideas. In our scripture reading, it's Jesus' last night on earth. It's the moment of his arrest. And even then, Jesus understands that his enemy is not the crowd of men who have come with swords and clubs to arrest him. Jesus knows that the enemy is never ultimately a person or a group of people or even an army or a nation of people. The enemy, in the end, is always an idea. And no sword can ever kill an idea. It was the Apostle Paul who would later say, "For our struggle is not against blood and flesh, but against cosmic powers of this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil." Paul was trying to name the complex, hidden reality of evil that theologians have struggled to name ever since. The forces and powers in this world that seem always to be working against goodness and love, against our well-being, against shalom and the common good. Paul calls them the dark powers and forces of evil, but he does not personify them. He does not claim that any one person or group of people or even humanity itself is the source or the embodiment of those evil forces. There is something else, he suggests, some power that transcends humanity and even human nature that we are wrestling with. This truth is at the heart of Dr. King Jr.'s third principle of nonviolent action, which is that nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice or evil, not people. King understood what Jesus and Paul knew, that our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities. The philosophy of the sword always seeks to defeat people. But the way of nonviolence, it seeks to defeat evil without demonizing people. And in so doing, it makes possible this possibility to convert those who have been overtaken by those powers and principalities. It's not a naive ideal, it's courageous, aggressive, audacious work. For years, a German city in northeast Bavaria had been flooded by neo-Nazi visitors. The city was home to the grave of Adolf Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess. It had become a popular pilgrimage destination for neo-Nazis who would march through the city as a group along this popular route leading to the gravesite. In 2014, the residents of that city finally organized a nonviolent movement of resistance against those neo-Nazis. They used Twitter to recruit sponsors from around the world to donate money for a walkathon. They asked those sponsors to donate cash for each step marched by the neo-Nazis along that route, with all the cash going to programs that actually fight Nazis. It was billed as Germany's most involuntary walkathon. Instead of greeting those neo-Nazis with violence, the residents hung banners along the route welcoming them to the the Nazis Against Nazis walkathon. They posted signs throughout the route encouraging the neo-Nazi marchers to keep walking to raise more money. Organizers put out a table of bananas to help them keep up their energy so that they could keep walking to keep raising more money. They even painted numbers on the pavement so those marchers would be forced to see how much money they had raised at every milestone. And at the end of that route, they passed out certificates to those neo-Nazi marchers to show them just how much money they had raised to fight their own Nazi movement. 10,000 euros, about $12,000. They went right to an organization that helps neo-Nazis defect from the movement. The campaign was so successful that other German cities began to emulate it too. The people of that city understood what Jesus and Dr. King preached, that the aim is to defeat evil, not people. It's a shift away from the philosophy of the sword, which always leads to death. Not only real physical death of victims and perpetrators, but the slow moral, spiritual death of all of us. Jesus' fight was never against people, not even the people who sought to destroy him. His fight was against political and religious ideas that gave rise to systems that abused and humiliated people. For Jesus, it made no sense to destroy one human to save another. That would require us to become a monster, to defeat a monster, only in the process to discover that the monster was ultimately an idea, not a person after all. We can't defeat an idea with a sword. Something more is necessary. Before the collapse of apartheid in South Africa, residents in the townships placed burning candles in their front windows as an act of nonviolent resistance and a symbol of hope and freedom. The police were known to come into the people's homes and blow out the candles. And it quickly became a joke among all the children in those townships that the mighty South African government was afraid of candles. Every night, those children would light dozens of candles in hundreds of houses. And then they would wait at their front doors to greet the police officers as they arrived. They would even clear the way for those officers to come inside to perform their nightly duty of extinguishing those dangerous candles. And before long, all those living in the townships knew that in the end, the joke was really on those police. Those candles served as a daily reminder of who was really free and who was not. Where does that hope and confidence come from? Dr. King tied nonviolent action directly to what is going on inside us. He understood that to resist external physical violence, a person had to quiet the internal violence of spirit, as he called it, that dwells within each of us. Because if we do not heal that violence, we will transmit it onto others. The only way to avoid the impulse to defeat the person instead of injustice is to heal that bitterness and rage and resentment and judgment within us. And King called this the internal violence of the spirit. And he knew that it's impossible to practice nonviolence without first tapping into the deep reservoir of God's grace. That's why when people asked to join the movement, King insisted that they sign a pledge. Part of that pledge required members to meditate daily on the teachings and life of Jesus, and to walk and talk in the manner of love, and to pray daily to be used by God in order that all might be free, to sacrifice personal wishes in order that all might be free, to observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy, to seek to perform regular service for others and for the world, to refrain from the violence of fist, tongue, or heart, and to strive to be in good spiritual and bodily health. And did you notice, by the way, what was not on King's list? Things like meditate daily on cable news commentaries, observe a daily practice of reading and posting inflammatory memes on Facebook, engage in snarky social media warfare, check the latest swing state polls every hour on the hour. King understood that we can't just drop the philosophy of the sword and expect to be able to practice nonviolence. We must adopt a new philosophy of love that can only be formed by daily encounters with God's grace. That's the only way nonviolent action is possible and sustainable. Without experiencing God's daily grace, we will just keep trying to defeat people. We will just keep dying these little, slow deaths in our relationships, in our communities, in our country, in our very souls. In his book, Strive Toward Freedom, King wrote about getting up to like 40 calls a day at his home, people threatening to kill him and his family. And one night he came home feeling defeated. His family was asleep. He slumped into a chair. He prayed to God. He said, I'm at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. And he said he heard an inner voice speak to him in that moment. It said, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and God will be at your side forever. And he said that in that moment, his doubt dissolved and his uncertainty disappeared. And he was ready to face anything. Our takeaways for today: all who live by the sword will die by the sword. Nonviolent action seeks to defeat evil without demonizing people. God will be at our side whenever we stand up for truth and justice.